My name is Marjai Neal. I am a poet. I am currently studying journalism and Black studies at the University of Missouri-Columbia. So I was really honored when the Housing Assistance Council asked me to perform at this conference because growing up, I was in and out of homeless shelters. I ate at soup kitchens. I relied heavily on housing assistance programs. So I really thought that it was a full circle moment, and I love giving back to my community, especially if I've experienced these things firsthand. So I want to share a piece of my story and my testimony with you about my journey through homelessness and kind of what I define home as. So this poem is about hope and resilience and homelessness. I was 11 years old when I found out home wasn't a physical place. That home is like your heart. It can break and bend, but what's broken can always be fixed and mended. My mother was evicted when I was 11. She had 3 little girls and only $200 in her pocket and no one to turn to for guidance. I seen the light leave her eyes and I knew life would never be the same again. I was 11 when I moved into my first homeless shelter, packed my bedroom up in 4 duffel bags and dumped my pride on the sidewalk. And I swore that I was unlucky, undeserving. And at 11, I heard the craziest stories about babies being ripped away from their mothers and women being used as target practice and men who couldn't catch a break so they caught a bullet instead. And the homeless shelter was a melting pot of Black and brown bodies being used as beef to stir the pot of capitalism, to keep a cynical cycle going. I was just a child thrown into a world I didn't even think I belonged to, and my eyes were heavy from carrying around this secret. And at the age of 11, I was afraid that if people knew the village that was raising me were living in a homeless shelter, I would be crucified by my peers, made fun of for eating at a soup kitchen or washing my clothes by hand and letting the sun dry them, that my home had roaches and my 3 sisters and I all slept in the same room, telling each other silly stories under the smoke-smelling covers. I didn't want to be misunderstood. And I just wanted people to understand that the most perishable people are the most polite and willing to help. That there are people in this world who would give you their last because material possessions can't protect you at night. That melting pots need all ingredients to become stew, to feed and to nourish, to provide warmth and much needed energy. And at 11, I was taught a very valuable lesson. That home isn't a house, it's a feeling. It's relief and reconciliation. It's love and laughter bouncing off the walls of your heart. Home is within you, not 4 walls and material possessions, but it's memories and moments that were meant solely for you. Home is wherever you are. Home is me. Home is my mother and my sisters. And at the age of 11, I learned that love will lead you where your heart needs to rest and be at peace. And that's really where home is at. My name is Marjai Neal. I am
so grateful for that moment. Thank you, Marjai. Good afternoon. My name is Teresa Singleton, Senior Vice President and Community Affairs Officer for the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and it is truly my privilege to be here and to introduce our next speaker, the Rev Dr. William Barber II. Before doing that, I'd like to take one moment and congratulate the Housing Assistance Council on its 50th. As a former staff member and a new board member, I am especially proud of the tremendous work HAC does every day. This is an organization that has been compassionate in its vision and resolute in its purpose, serve the poorest of the poor in the most rural places. And this sense of purpose is something that HAC and its incredible staff have in common with our keynote speaker, who once said one of my favorite quotes, "It isn't an alarm clock that wakes me up it's purpose." Today, we are joined by a national champion in the fight against poverty and inequality, the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II. Reverend Barber is renowned for many things, including as an author and lecturer, and for his leadership at organizations, including the Poor People's Campaign. A defining role of his work is his ability and commitment to building unusually inclusive coalitions that are multiracial and interfaith, and that reach across gender, age, and class lines to address poverty, inequality, and systemic racism. Reverend Barber asked the critical questions and challenges our society and asks us to aspire to meet our promise. His is a voice of reason, of passion and compassion, and one that speaks in the most resolute terms for justice in all its forms for all our people. It is my pleasure to introduce the Reverend Dr. William Barber.
41 years in the coal mines. I have black lung, and it's just unfathomable what these poor coal miners have to go through in order to get what they have worked for and deserve.
At one time, poverty was a temporary condition. You were on a down slope for a minute, but you could bounce back up. We can't bounce back up today. It's permanent. We're not going back to the factory and building cars and trucks like we once did.
A job working at McDonald's or the grocery store doesn't pay enough for one person to live.
We work a 40-hour work week, still not enough. Living from paycheck to paycheck. Rent is $600 a month. We got water bill, electricity. I do this for my kids, and it hurts.
I'm 46 years old. I've lived in poverty here in West Virginia every day of my life. And I'm working. I am a working poor with a bachelor's degree. I'm doing the best I can with what I have.
We were in the height of mass water shutoffs. This entire neighborhood was shut off all at one time.
I saw all my neighbors get shut off right in front of me. It was kind of terrifying.
I'm 42 years old, and I'm a cashier at McDonald's. I had lost my house. You're welcome to come inside. There's a lot of people that are living in their cars. You never notice until you're in the same situation.
I don't have stuff to give my children. I'm paying all these bills, and they need school clothes and stuff. They be asking me for, I can't give it to them.
Now I'm a Kansas farmer's wife. Kansas farmers are committing suicide. Why? They're usually in debt up to their eyeballs.
I see poverty in my own community. You know, there's a 70% unemployment rate in the reservation right now.
Here in New York City, we're home to millionaires and billionaires, and we have so many people living in the street, and that's just not right.
I've been a homeless veteran twice, lived in a shelter.
I've been living down here since I was 17.
My only chance of going to college was joining the Army. We are demanding that we stop the war on our poor.
700,000 people in this country are on the verge of losing their food stamps.
This budget calls for shrinking the social safety net programs like Medicare.
I just know that everything that's happening to us isn't right.
I'm in stage 5 of kidney disease. I fell behind on my health care, and they canceled my health insurance, and they told me I have to wait until open enrollment. There's only 5 stages of kidney disease, and I'm in the 5th stage. Murder, it's murder. You know, if you ask me, it's murder.
I lost a son to gun violence, and I lost a daughter.
No parent in America should have to bury their child for lack of medicated space.
I'm wailing because my children
My God.
are no more.
My God. My God, Kelly.
Well, I'm wailing, y'all. Wailing. Because my babies ain't no more. How many more babies? How many more children? No more.
I want you to know that when hands that once picked cotton join hands of Latinos, join hands of progressive whites, join faith hands and labor hands and Asian hands and Native American hands and poor hands and wealthy hands with a conscience and gay hands and straight hands and trans hands and Christian hands and Jewish hands and Muslim hands and Hindu hands and Buddhist hands. When we all get together, we are an instrument of redemption. When we join hands, we can revive and make sure that the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and equal protection under the law is never taken away from anybody. So I got a question. Are the rejected ready to revive and declare that this land is your land, this land is my land, this land is our land, and together from the State House to the White House, the rejected are going to demand that this nation never give up on being one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Hello to all of you. I am so honored to come to you as co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign and president of Repairers of the Breach. And on behalf of my co-chair, the Rev Dr Liz Harris with the Kairos Center and the 47 state coordinating committees of the Poor People's Campaign, over 2,500 clergy persons that are part, religious leaders, the over 200 partners. And as we right now, even now in the middle of planning for December 13th, tomorrow Monday in Washington, D.C., calling people to come together to demand that get it done in 21, Build Back Better and beyond, voting rights, ending the filibuster, passing a $15 living wage. I greet you in the spirit of struggle, and I am honored to be here with the Housing Assistance Council for your event, this National Rural Housing Conference. You know, I come from the rural South, born in the rural South, raised in the rural South. In fact, I was raised in the 13th poorest congressional district in this country, down in Eastern North Carolina. And I'm honored to be a part of all the work. You've been working since I was 8 years old, 1971. And so I honor all of you who are working. I honor your leadership and those who have continuously stood, particularly in this 50th anniversary of the Housing Assistance Council. You know, when I think about this moment, I've had one message across the country, and that is that we need to have in this country to shift the political narrative, to declare that we won't be silent anymore, a mass Poor People's Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington, a generationally transformative gathering where we all bring our silos together, led by poor and low wealth people, the rejected of this society, religious leaders, advocates, and even wealthy people with a conscience. And I want to talk to you about that, why it's so necessary that we have this coming together, that the remnants of this country come together. We're inviting and saying, let's do it June 18th. We've already had massive commitments. Hope you'll join as well. And we'll tell you on June 18th, we're going to have this mass Poor People's Low-Wage Workers Assembly, Moral March on Washington, focusing on realities of systemic racism, systemic poverty, and all of that includes in terms of houses and wages, homes and wages, and income and disparities, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. We're going to put a face on the realities in this nation, as well as lay out an agenda not rooted in the Washington two-step, but rooted in the kind of response this nation must have if we're going to be serious about this being a democracy that is not about establishing temporary benevolence, but is about establishing justice. You know, I come from a faith tradition in rural North Carolina. And when I read the great spiritual truths of the Bible, like Luke 4, where Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. And the word poor there is the word patokos in Greek. It means those who've been made poor by economic exploitation. When I think about the fact that Jesus was born homeless, was born with nowhere to lay his head, that when in our tradition, when God chose to reveal God's self, God came through backdoor divinity. He came through a rural couple in a rural town called Bethlehem, where they were being forced into homelessness, forced to travel, even in the final trimester of a woman's pregnancy, because of the greed and the tax cuts for the wealthy that were imposed by Herod and Caesar. When I read Isaiah 10, that says, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey. When I read Amos 5, when it talks about we must, because there are times when injustice is so rife that we must push to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. When I read in Ezekiel chapter 16, and the 49th verse there says, now this is the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant. They were overfed. They were unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore, I did away with them. And the word of God actually says that Ezekiel says on God's behalf that Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed because the leadership refused to care properly for the least of these. When I look at all of these texts, when I look at Matthew 25 in the Bible, it says that nations, not individuals, are going to be judged by how we treat the least of these, the stranger, the immigrant, the poor, the homeless, the hurting. And then when I read our Constitution of these United States, and I look at the glaring realities of systemic racism and systemic poverty and homelessness and underhousing and ecological devastation and underfunding of public education and the denial of healthcare and the overfunding of the war economy and the false distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. And I look at how our Constitution actually says that we are supposed to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common good, promote the general welfare of all people, ensure equal protection under the law. It is clear to me that right now we face a crisis of possibility, a crisis of civilization, a crisis of morality, and a crisis in this democracy. Even as I come on to tape this keynote, I was just looking at the TV. This is Bible week, they say. And I was watching legislators in the Congress lauding the Bible, lauding its precepts, saying that they wanted every policy in the Congress to be reviewed by the ethics of the Bible. And I said, really? I mean, these are people that claim that they love the Bible, love God, but they vote against dealing with homeless. They vote against living wages. They vote against poverty. And I thought about how distorted it could be, how confused or just how sinful people are, how evil in their mindset that you could get up on a congressional floor on C-SPAN and thump the Bible and think that the Bible supports your greed, your racism, your homophobia, your catering to the profit-driven corporations and discarding the poor. You know, delusion is a terrible thing. And when I saw that delusion just a few minutes ago, I know that it is clear that we face a crisis of democracy, a moral crisis, a crisis of civilization, and a crisis of possibility. You know, when we think about it, so much so in this country, when we start having debates, we look at the conversations. Think about how the conversations start. Even after having gone through COVID, 20+ million people lost their job, millions infected, 750,000 deaths, millions of people are facing eviction, 8 million more people falling into poverty, while billionaires made over $2 trillion in the first 18 months of COVID. And when you listen to the people in Washington, D.C., all they want to talk about is bottom lines. How much does something cost, whether it's 3 trillion or 1 trillion? They want to talk about whether or not they need to put work requirements and other requirements on things for poor and low wealth people, but they give free money to the corporations, free money to those that are driven by the profit and the greedy, just free, as though somehow their wealth means that they're going to be honest and do the right thing. And I thought about and think about every day how this points to this crisis we have. We got more wealth than ever before in the history of the world, more. We have more possibility to address the issues that are before us, more. And yet we still have these strange conversations where we start with the wrong question. We start too often, especially the political persons, they start with the question, what I call the possibility strangling question. How much will it cost to do something? Rather than the truly moral question, how much will it cost us to not to do it and continue the way we have been? Nobel Peace Prize economist Joseph Stiglitz said this should be the first question of a moral economy. How much does it cost for us to maintain the inequalities and disparities that exist all around us? But too often we get caught up in a commentary about a particular policy. One group wants to not do nothing but help the billionaires. That's all they want to do. That's all they want to do. Another group just wants to see how much they can cut out of a program and still be able to claim how great it is. Think about this debate about the Build Back Better. Now, the Build Back Better plan does some important things. It extends and enhances child tax credit, which will help the poorest families. It will support parents who are working. It gives universal pre-K. It establishes universal pre-K to 6 million 3- and 4-year-olds. It does some work with climate investments, and it has $130 billion to expand Medicaid and affordable care coverage. It does provide some money for uninsured individuals living in states that didn't expand Medicaid. It does provide some money for affordable housing. The plan invests $150 billion in affordable housing provisions, including the construction and rehabilitation of more than 1 million affordable homes across the US, and investment in rental assistance and housing vouchers. It does some important things, but the plan, while it reduces, investments, it provides investments, for elder care and Pell grants. There's so many things that were cut out of the plan. But we also have to look at, even when we talk about an investment of 1.9 trillion over 10 years, which is only $190 billion a year in an economy where the gross domestic product is over $21 trillion in 1 year. We cannot claim that this proposed investment is transformative, is an end all. Even David Axelrod recently just said Democrats and others should stop saying it's transformative and just call it what it is, responsive, an attempt to respond to needs. And it's not a full response. It's far below the $10 trillion that the Economic Policy Institute says we need to address the major inequalities that existed before COVID and were exacerbated during COVID. 10 trillion, $1 trillion a year, which would barely be 5% of what our gross domestic product is. 10 trillion is what we really need. We have work to do because our debates aren't in line with the realities that we face in communities, and especially in rural communities where we don't have TV coverage and oftentimes it's off the media screen. Too much of what we're doing is not in line with the values we claim. First, because we lie about scarcity. Yes, scarcity is a lie. I was speaking a few months ago to the National Special Rapporteur on Poverty, and he shared with me that we do not have a scarcity of resources in this country or in the world. We do not have a scarcity of money. That's a fact. We do not have a scarcity of ideas and how to address the problems that need to be addressed, that connect the interlocking injustices connected to poverty. What we do have is a scarcity of collective moral consciousness. And this is why When you have faith, as I have, or when you have a deep moral commitment, as who people have who may not believe in a particular faith, and you stand beside poor and low wealth people, you cannot accept the refrain, we just don't have the money. We just can't do this. The real truth is we can't afford not to if we want to see this democracy salvaged and not move into a civil oligarchy and eventually an autocracy. Recently, I was at the Vatican in a meeting with economists and philosophers, and theologians of different faiths. And Pope Francis wrote to us and said, today, we see that the world has never been so rich. Never been so rich. But despite such abundance, poverty and inequality persist and grow in these times of opulence when it should be possible to put an end to poverty. The powers of one-track thinking say nothing of the poor, the elderly, the migrants, the unborn, and the seriously ill are mostly invisible and mostly treated as disposable. We still have too many policies and too many angles and too many attempts to say there is no room in this inn called America. There is no room in this human family for all of God's children. I don't know if people realize that, but that many of the people that we decided to call essential workers during COVID, because before COVID, they were service workers. During COVID, we gave them a new name, but we did not change our policy. Most of them, many of them that I've talked to, they continue to feel disposable and expendable, not essential. They listen at the debates, they don't hear their names, they don't hear poverty. They see outright refusal to pass policies to address the crumbling infrastructure of people's daily lives. Or they see other people that just try to do the least amount as possible. They ask the question, how is it that we can spend $21 trillion on war and militarism since 2001, according to the Institute for Policy Studies, and then we have a hissy fit and can't find it within our moral ability to spend 3 trillion or even 6 trillion or 10 trillion over 10 years to invest in the uplift of all people in this society. We gave $2 trillion in COVID relief to businesses that they didn't even have to prove they were impacted by COVID, the pandemic, or that they would keep their workers. 1.2 trillion of that, some of that money was given without even going through the Congress. Some say we've given as high as $4 trillion in less than 2 years to profit-driven corporations, but we have a hissy fit over 3 trillion over 10 years, or 6 trillion over 10 years, to lift up all the people of this society. And the COVID pandemic has put a spotlight on the nation's poor, a spotlight on homelessness and the lack of affordable housing and low-wage workers. It has put a spotlight on the crisis of possibility, the crisis of civilization, and the crisis of morality. And we must face this crisis. How? We cannot play with it anymore. We have to tell it the truth. We have to, not only in our conferences, but in the public square. We must put a face on the gravity of the problem. And we must say very clearly that before COVID ever hit, that's why we can't just get back to before COVID. Before COVID ever hit, according to a report from the Mailman School of Public Health, 250,000 people died every year in the richest nation in the world from poverty and the collateral damage of poverty, lack of housing, lack of wages, lack of health care. That's 700 people a day were dying from the pandemic of poverty. 7 people died from vaping. They called a meeting in the White House. They called congressional hearings. 700 people dying a day from poverty. And there's no outcry. There's no real congressional hearings about it. 250,000 a year, even before COVID. Before COVID, there were 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country. And I want you to listen to these numbers because they tell a graphic story that we must put before the nation, not only in numbers, but in faces. 52%, or 38 million of our children below 18 are in poverty. Over 50% of our children live in poverty in the wealthiest nation in the world. 41% of our elders, 21 million, 42% of men, 65 million, 45% of women before COVID, 74 million, 33% of white people, 66 million, 60% of Black people, 26 million, 64% of Latino people, 38 million, 40% of Asian people, 8 million, 58% of Native Indigenous people, 2.1 million. That means that 43% of this nation was in poverty before COVID, and 8 million more people fell into poverty during COVID. In America, 32 million people make less than a living wage before COVID, less than a living wage of $15. The number goes up when you get closer to the true living wage. We haven't raised the minimum wage in 12 years, and in this country that we live in, there's not a county or a state where you can afford a basic 1 or 2 bedroom apartment working at a minimum wage job of $7.25. And the minimum wage for restaurant workers and those in food service is only $2.13 an hour plus tax. This is where we are. This is where we are as a country. This is the real deal. 87 million people uninsured or underinsured in the richest nation in the world. We're the only nation in this world, of the richest nations in this world, 25 richest, that does not offer some form of universal health care. Think about that moral crisis. We don't offer universal health care and we throw people out on the street. And then we won't pay them a living wage. That is a crisis, a moral crisis, a crisis of democracy and civilization. And when you think about housing, before the pandemic, there were, some numbers say there were as high as 8 to 11 million people who were either homeless or on the verge of homelessness. And we know 1/3 of all poor people live in the South, in rural areas. That's not even counting the rural farming areas, like, for instance, in places like Kansas, where literally I found out as we were touring the country, some Kansas farmers commit suicide because of the stress of not having anything. And they try to make it look like it's not suicide in order to be able to provide for their families. But before COVID ever hit, alongside cuts in federal housing assistance and the affordable housing stock, over the past 30 years, rents, as you know, have gone up faster than incomes. From 2001 to 2013, renters' incomes grew by only 0.5%. But rents increased by 13%. In 2021, there was no place, as I said earlier, in this country where an individual working a full-time job, earning the federal minimum wage, could afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. In fact, in many states, you have to make work at least 80 to 100 hours a week to earn a basic living wage and maybe be able to earn enough money as an individual to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. During the pandemic, housing became a public health necessity and a public health measure, the necessity of public housing. During the pandemic and due to the economic impact of the pandemic, at one point in 2020, and we haven't dealt enough with this, and that's why we've got to get this in the public square, and we have to have a mass coming together. 30 to 40 million people were at the risk of eviction. Although the evictions and sweeps of encampments continued in many places, the eviction and foreclosure moratoriums prevented even greater numbers. But then the best some people in Congress could do under Dan Trump and under McConnell was to say, we will give you a moratorium on your rent for 3 months, but then on the 4th month, you'll owe the 4th month and the prior 3. Well, how are you gonna pay the prior 3 if you couldn't pay the first month in the first place? Although more than $46 billion was allocated to help housing costs, most of this money was left to languish in the bureaucratic processes in the states. Many of those states led by governors and legislators that don't want this kind of money to go to people in the first place. These conditions prompted rent strikes. We haven't had enough talk about that in this country. Across the country, people were also blocking eviction hearings and engaging in other actions to stay in their homes. And for the most part, the media hasn't talked about it. And we haven't seen these people invited to Congress or invited to the White House to put a face on the crisis that we're in. The federal moratorium on eviction was lifted in 2021. There were at that point at least 15 million people at risk of eviction. Now, post the pandemic, the rise in rents is even larger than anticipated and will increase inflation and drive the other incomes that households spend on the things they need down. This is why we've been calling for the following in the Poor People's Campaign, and we join you in this housing coalition. We join you. Stop all evictions. We don't just need moratoriums, we need forgiveness. Stop them all. Stop the evictions. Stop sweeping encampments where people are trying to just make it. Stop these foreclosures in the midst of what's going on. Establish a true count of homelessness and housing insecurity, because when people tell us there are approximately 550,000 people who are homeless on any given night, the incredible inaccuracy of that number results in policy responses that are far too weak and too small to address the scope of the problem. We got to mobilize resources and capacity to turn vacant buildings into affordable, safe housing units. All of these vacant buildings could house so many of our people. During the pandemic, hotels were turned into temporary housing. We can do more of this, and we can do it quickly. We got to call for the relieving of housing and rental debt that cannot be paid. We have to do this. There's a precedent for this in the 1930s. So we've done it before. But too often the reason we don't do some of these things is because it gets racialized. Poverty is seen as only a Black thing or a Latino thing, or rural white folk that we can dismiss. We've got to change that. We've got to prohibit rent increases. Rent increases that are incommensurate with economic conditions and the ability to pay. Instead, we've got to pursue rent stabilization policies for basic needs like housing, healthcare, water, especially in the rural areas. Especially in the rural South where I'm from, where over a third of the people are poor. And if we do these things and tell the story, a lot of the states that we claim are red states will not be red states, because most of the people in rural areas, particularly poor and low-wealth people, regardless of color, don't vote because they never hear Democrats or Republicans talking about poverty. We did a study on this and found out that in most of the battleground states, the poor and low-wealth people make up 40% of the electorate. In the country, it's 30% of the electorate, almost a third of the electorate. And we must build a movement that forces the faces, the voices, the stories, and the agendas of poor and low-wealth people and those struggling with housing and homelessness right into the public square. That's why we got to raise the minimum wage. We need to raise the minimum wage, not just to a living wage, but to a housing wage. And you know, a national housing raise would be $24.90 for a two-bedroom apartment at market value, and just over $20 for a one-bedroom apartment. But underneath these numbers, there's people like my friend Vanessa and Brother Winslow, the Apache Nation, who are fighting because a multinational company is not only trying to take their holy land, but poison their waters and disrupt the Apache living on the reservation in Arizona. Or I think about Amy. It's a poor white woman with a master's degree, a teacher struggling in the mountains of West Virginia, just trying to make it, fought for the governor to expand money for teachers, found out that when the governor did something sneaky, he expanded the teacher pay a little bit by cutting Medicaid and cutting food stamps. Or I think about Pam Morrison and the other miners' daughters and miners' wives who are fighting in Appalachia, in the rural part of Appalachia, who need living wages, who need housing. Or I think about Pam, my dear sister down in Alabama, who was forced by predatory lending to purchase a trailer 3 times higher than it was worth. And now because of the mold, her children have to wear a mask. She died from COVID because she didn't have any insurance. And she faced a home where the sewage ran up in the yard because the county, the very county that Dr. King marched through in the Selma to Montgomery March, off the beaten path, back up in the rural area, they chose to run the sewage to the dog pound and some stores, but not to the houses and the trailers. Or I think about Leon, a veteran I met in a homeless camp in Aberdeen, where in a city of 16,000, over 1,000 people are living in homeless camps, the highest concentration of white millennials living homelessness. He's got a flag outside of the car he sleeps in. And I asked him, why do you have that flag there? He said, I want people to see what happens underneath the flag. I was allowed to run billion-dollar equipment in the military, but now I come home and I can't hardly get treatment. I can't flip a burger, and it's not right. Or I think about poor people in Harlan County, one of the 30th poorest counties in this country, in Eastern Kentucky. And the homelessness and the home struggles that exist there. Coal miners who watch policies be implemented that allow multinational corporations to take over the coal mines and undo their union rights and undo their pensions. I think about all of this. I think about the people that you see every day. And we continue to hear far too many say, there's no room in the end. But it's because of this. And all I wanted to say to you, there's no lack of scarcity. We got the ideas, we know how to fix it, but what we do not have is the collective moral consciousness to change. And that only happens through a movement. That only happens when we come together out of our various silos, not in a new organization, but in a movement. And when we don't let people say, well, what one thing do we need? Poor and low wealth people. We say, we don't know, it's no one thing, it's all of them. And we don't let people divide us up and give a little bit to housing and then block voting rights, or give a little bit to labor unions, but then block healthcare. No, because the same people that block living wages and block union rights and block dealing with homelessness and the home and the housing crisis and education underfunding and voter suppression, they are the same people. And if they are cynical enough to be together, there has to be a coming together, a moral coming together to shift the moral narrative by all of us who know better and who have a quarrel with the way things are and know that it is possible for them not to be as they are. We have to have a moral coming together. That's why we are calling in this moment for a massive moral march on Washington, poor people's, low-wage workers, moral march on Washington, poor people's assembly, moral march on Washington, not as a day, not as a remembrance of, say, the March on Washington in 1960. No. A coming together fresh in this generation of all of those who are rejected and hurt in those interlocking injustices. And not for somebody to speak on their behalf, but for the people themselves impacted to take the stage, show America the faces, make America hear the voices behind the numbers, show what's going to happen and how bad it is, and then offer an agenda and declare that this is not just a day, but a declaration that we will not go quietly into the night, that we will not just walk away. We won't be silent anymore. We're going to also not only reshift the moral narrative, call for a third Reconstruction, but we're going to exert that power for poor and low wealth people now represent, as I said, over a third of the electorate. And in many places, if just 20% of poor and low wealth people who face homelessness and face housing issues and wages issues, if they would organize around an agenda and vote not 30%, not 25%, 10 to 20% in many areas. We've done the data, we've looked at the metrics. They could determine who sits in the Senate, who sits in the presidency, who sits in the legislatures and in the Congress and in the government. And the posters won't tell you that because Most of the pollsters only want an election that where they have to count what the middle class does and what the wealthy do. But there is a sleeping giant. There's a sleeping giant. Those who have been rejected, and we must have a mass coming together that is a signal of a transformative moment where people rejected and poor and low wealth of every race and creed and sexuality, along with people of faith and people not of faith, but with a deep moral concern and advocacy, and even wealthy people with a conscience to help save the heart and soul of this nation and this democracy, as well as sound the call around the world. When I mentioned this in the Vatican, other countries said, no, we need to do that same thing in our countries. And what if we on July 18th, that's the day we targeted, July 18th, for a mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington, where before the nation, people impacted address the issues of poverty, racism, and housing, and ecological devastation of the war economy. Well, we've got to have, because what has happened is people have gotten too emboldened. We watched this country pass a $2 trillion tax cut for the wealthy, but now fight over a mere $1.9 trillion over 10 years. Oh, we need a coming together. We live now at a time where 400 people make an average of $97,000 an hour, and 3 people have more money than the bottom 50% of America. And one person, Alan Musk, I was talking to Jeffrey Sachs, and he said a person working at a job of $30,000 a year would have to work 7 million years to earn as much money as Elon Musk has earned. This level of wealth inequality is not the way it's supposed to be. This ain't even about socialism. It's about the establishment of justice and promoting the general welfare of all people. Some 400 families make an average of $97,000 an hour, and I've been arrested I don't know how many times, standing with people who simply want $15 an hour in a union. We must have a mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington for a massive moral reset and a declaration and a coming forth and a challenging the narrative in the midst of this crisis of democracy and crisis of public stability. And we must declare we won't be silent anymore. We must have a declaration and not just a day. Dr. King was shot and killed before he could call together this massive gathering in 1968. But that night before he was shot, he said nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. We have to give ourselves to this movement. And we have to give ourselves to this movement in some ways greater than even the movement was then, because it must be very diverse. It must be a moral fusion movement. That's what we're trying to work on in the Poor People's Campaign. That's why I accepted your invitation. We don't need to leave our organizations. Our organizations need to come together in a massive moral movement. Because remember, we didn't get here just because of Trump, all this division and denial. Remember in 1968, after Dr. King was killed, Kevin Phillips sent a memo to a sitting president called Nixon at that time. You can read about it in a book called The Illusion by Jonathan Sewell. And that memo said, we must do something called positive polarization, intentionally split the nation. We must use racism, homophobia, and poverty and classism and the anti-war sentiments against the anti-war movement and split the nation. Pat Buchanan conferred on it and said to Richard Nixon, we must split it and split it, the nation in two. And if we do this, this is the way we can hold on to power. It was all about the lust of power. The division we see now is the division that was planned. It's been pushed and promulgated and financed and weaponized and charismatized all the way since Richard Nixon. Reagan used it, Bush used it, Trump inherited it. This division didn't just come from one president. It's a whole system of division. And they said when they would do the division, they would deny that they were doing it intentionally, and they would use words like tax cuts and entitlements as code words, but they would fight every effort of social uplift, and they would only fund their wealthy financiers. And they would use the division on these other issues to turn people against each other that if they came together had the very power to reshape the economic architect of this nation. That's what Dr. King said is the heart of racism and division. It's about making and dividing the poor, low-wealth masses of Black people and white people and Latino people in a way to keep them from coming together because they have the power to reshape the economic architecture of the nation. But also the reason we're here is because of the economic policies of trickle-down economics, Reaganomics, the myth that says all you got to do is shake policy to the top and a little bit of trickle down and everybody else will be all right, but also neoliberalism, which says if you just lift from the middle, everything is going to be all right. And with these economic philosophies shaping policies, particularly since the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan, by the way, went to Philadelphia, Mississippi, when he started his campaign and argued against these big bucks, he said, with T-bone steaks and porterhouse steaks and lines with food stamps. He was coding word, dividing people, when in fact, most of the people that were on food stamps were poor white people. But with this trickle-down economics and with this neoliberalism, even Pope Francis called these things magical formulas that entrap the world and the nation. What do we have now? Because of the US economy has grown more than 18 times in the past 50 years. From 1973 to 2016, productivity went up 73%, but hourly compensation only went up 12%. From 1968 to 2017, the top 1% share of the economy has nearly doubled. In 2017, the 400 wealthiest Americans own more wealth than the bottom 64% of the US population. The 400 people own more than 204 million people. And of these 400, only 2 are Black, 5 are Latino. Just 3 had a combined wealth of $248 billion, the same amount of wealth as the bottom 50% of the country. And meanwhile, the cost of basic needs and like housing and healthcare and education have soared. That's how we got to these policies, because of these false economic philosophies, these distorted, misguided of trickle-down economics and neoliberalism. In order to break it, we must have a mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly, not as a day, but as a declaration, not as a moment, but as a movement, a moral march on Washington, bringing together everybody to put a face on the problem, a voice on the problem, to call for a moral reset, to call the poor and low-wealth people of this country, who represent now nearly 40% of the electorate in some places, that you have more power than you have used. And if we come together around this agenda, we can create not a crisis of possibility, but possibility itself. We can end poverty from the bottom up. We wrote a resolution called the Third Reconstruction, Ending Poverty and Low Wealth from the Bottom Up, and we listed out for Congress 12 things we must resolve to do. I hope you'll go read it. And we can do them. It's possible. Right now it's possible. We do not have a scarcity of resources or a scarcity of ideas. We have a scarcity of moral consciousness. And that's why we have to do this, because where we're headed now is morally indefensible, constitutionally inconsistent, and economically insane. Where we're having that. We better have a third Reconstruction in this country. Do you realize that we invested in housing and invested in living wages, it would grow even more the economy? We better make poverty and housing a top legislative priority. It's time for poor and low wealth people who have power to come together with their allies. It's time for us to truly measure poverty and tell the truth in this country and stop using that faulty measurement, the government measure of poverty. It's time to protect the constitutional rights of assembly. It's time to have legislation that seeks to not just deal a little bit with poverty, but end it and low wealth from the bottom up. It's time to raise the minimum wage to a living wage and guaranteed incomes and guaranteed right to join unions. It's time to use even the power of deficit spending on the front end to invest and meet these pressing needs of the 140 million poor and low wealth people. And by investing in programs that lift from the bottom and rebuild the economy, we will strengthen society and will benefit on the back end. It's time to guarantee quality health. We cannot have senators and congresspeople going to Washington, D.C. and they get free health care only because they got elected, but then they don't want the people that elected them to have the same thing. It's time to guarantee safe and quality housing for all and to guarantee the right to water and clean water and sanitation. It's time to implement a federal jobs program that ensures not only good jobs, but increases public investments in infrastructure in poor and low wealth communities, and especially where they are first impacted communities because of climate change. It's time for us to enact relief from student debt and medical debt and housing debt and utilities debt and other household and personal debt that cannot be paid. It's time. If we can forgive corporations because we claim they're too big to fail, people are too precious to fail, too precious, too created in the image of God to fail. It's time that we cut the military budget. Right now, we're spending 54 cents of every discretionary dollar on militarism and the war economy, going most of military contractors, much of what they don't even want or need, while we spend less than 16 cents of every discretionary dollar on housing and education and wages. It's time to change that. We ought to have an immediate cut of military budget by 10% and put those funds in healthcare and housing and green infrastructure and anti-poverty program. It's time. And this time that we're in requires more than emails and texts and Zoom meetings. We must move nonviolently. We must move the masses of the people. Yes, in the streets. Yes, to the voting blocks. Yes, in the suites. But we must have a massive moral reset. We must have a massive moral moment. There's a scripture in Amos, as I close, where God literally says to Amos in the midst of tough times, he says, I'm telling you, God says, I'm telling you, go into the streets, cry loudly, act like something is wrong. Close the shops, close the schools, close the malls, and cry and say, not us, not me, not on our watch, not now. Enlist everybody you can to wail and cry and say, we cannot accept this. We are better than this. We must do better than this. And then it says, God says, and when I hear you in the street, when I hear the remnant of people who've been impacted, refusing to accept it, God says, then I'll visit you and help you until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. This remnant, the rejected must come together, the rejected. Everybody that's been rejected because of their poverty, their race, their gender, rejected by classism and racism and homophobia and Islamophobia and xenophobia. We must come together, poor and low wealth people, our advocates, religious leaders, and even wealthy people for the conscious, and have a massive poor people's low wage workers assembly moral march on Washington to shift the moral narrative, to declare we're not going anywhere, to present the nation an agenda that can save this house called America that is crumbling around us from the inside, because nearly 50% of its people are poor and low wealth. And a gathering that will say, we will not sit silently, and we will not let this sleeping giant sleep anymore, where nearly a third of the electorate is now poor and low wealth. Some might call it a moral Pentecost. Some might call it a time where we become moral defibrillators because the heart of the nation is sick. And we who have a heart decide to shock the nation with love and truth. But whatever it is, I know this, down through history, there's never been major transformation in this nation unless there was a generationally transformative movement. And that movement was signaled in some way by mass gatherings, whether it was in the abolition movement, the women's suffrage movement, the labor movement, the bonus marches of the 1930s, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the peace movement, on and on and on, the movements of Cesar Chavez and the Latino people. There's always had to be a movement, the homelessness movement, the anti-war movement, that seeks to shift the moral narrative, put a face on the depth of the crisis, offer an agenda that offers the nation a better way, refuses to go quietly into the night, and declares that we can do better than this. Somebody the other day said, well, we don't know if things will change, but we know if we don't do anything, things won't change. But we have plenty of history that when people come together, when Black and white abolitionists came together, they were able to transform the narrative around slavery and bring it down. when white and black women like Sojourner Truth and others who were women's suffragists, not just anti-slavery, when they came together, Quakers and others, they were able to win the right to vote. When the social gospel movement came together with workers that fought for labor, they were able to back up monopolies and back up greedy, profit-driven corporations. And Rosa Parks and King and white and black people and Jews and Gentiles and Christians came together. They were able to push Congress people and presidents that didn't want to do certain things to do what they said they weren't even going to do. When mamas got together in South Africa with bishops like Tutu and Methodist white ministers like Peter Story, they were able all over the world. Oh, we got plenty of evidence that when we come together, not just one time, not just one rally, but when we come together in a massive way to signal that it's on, we're not going in hiding, and we're not going to accept this. And we can use the mighty weapons of nonviolence and truth and love and justice, and even putting our body on the line, and even being willing to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience if necessary. And we do that. And we also use the courts, and we also use the voting boxes, and we also go into congressional suites. And when we put it all together and build a moral fusion movement where all of our silos find one another, we can transform this house we call America. Save it from this internal breakages. We can be repairers of the breach. And it's our time. It's our time. And we must do it. I look forward to seeing you in this movement. You're already there, but I look forward to us coming together in massive ways for the transformation. And so that we change this nation from a crisis of possibility to the realization of the possible. From a moral crisis to moral courage. From a crisis of democracy to a greater fulfillment of democracy. It's our time to come together. God bless you.
All right, I want to thank the Reverend Dr. Barber for recording that message for our conference. For you all to know, Reverend Barber lost a close family member this week, and so this afternoon wasn't possible, so he stayed up late night last night recording that message for us graciously. And so really on behalf of the HAC board, the folks here gathered, the HAC staff, I find it to be a real honor to hear the words. And as we just heard, we still have too many policies that say there's no room in this inn for all of America. So much of our history and our current policy has excluded people as we have communities that are being built. This happens within certain communities, between communities, entire geographies that have been told there's no room at the inn of America for you. Places HAC and many of you work come immediately to mind. Places like the Mississippi Delta, Indian Country, Dr. Barber's Eastern North Carolina, Congressman Clyburn's South Carolina. These all come to mind as examples of where geography and race meet in driving inequities. As housers, of course, we all know our job is to build communities. It's to make life better for our neighbors. And yet, as we've discussed, our industry, like others in America, has left people out and left them behind. I do believe we at this conference have been building toward equitable and just communities in our work. I firmly believe that. And yet, all that such work has earned us, I also believe, is that we have to wake up tomorrow and hold that same responsibility right out front and do it again and again. This work is clearly ongoing. So the simple fact of ensuring that everyone has a place at the end must remain, I believe, for us as housers. I mean, we're the ones building the inn. So look, our responsibility requires us to empower our neighbors. That's true. When HAC provides capacity building, technical assistance, training, lending, we try our very best not to parachute in from our Washington or Atlanta offices and tell folks in places like Alamosa, Colorado, what they need. We did some work there recently. Instead, we had a group of dedicated people from the community come to us, tell us what they needed to effectively have them help serve their neighbors. Community building works best when people come together and when we equip them with the tools they need. That's how I think we can be allies to a movement of people coming together, by empowering community members to make a difference. I really, running through my mind are points that we tie this to yesterday afternoon's panel discussion on rural America's diversity, in that the point was very well made. The system actually is working. It's working exactly as it's designed. Yesterday's panel and Reverend Barber's remarks remind us that the challenge isn't really about fixing the system, but to rebuild it with no racism, no anti-Semitism, no homophobia, no transphobia. Rebuild it with not one program in our federal or state or local public policy that purposefully or even inadvertently concentrates wealth and opportunity in some places and regions of the country, while complacently accepting rural decline as a reasonable price to pay for the renewed dynamism of other places. Our dynamic new board member, Teresa Singleton from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philly, has raised this, and she's raised the concept of allyship in her comments. Allyship it's not an identity for those of us in positions of privilege and power, seeking to operate as we do in solidarity with others. Allyship is a lifelong process for us of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals. I say us because many people in our community have that power and privilege, and yet still have a place in a community that they are facing marginalization. In the spirit of allyship, with the hope of achieving Reverend Dr. Barber's vision for a more equitable and just America, the question that keeps bouncing around in my head, and I don't have an answer. It's a question I'm grappling with, and one that I hope you ask yourself, or you may join me in asking during the rest of this conference. How do we, in the affordable housing industry, live a principled life every day that keeps us moving toward our vision for a future in which small towns and our rural communities can be equitable and just? So, powerful afternoon. I hope you appreciated this. Up next is a colleague of mine at HAC that has been grappling with these questions too. Shantaria Charleston was born and raised in downtown Atlanta, lived an urban life, and has been an extraordinary ally to rural places. Clearly, the world sees Terry and me in some pretty fundamentally different ways, right? The world imbues on us these certain responsibilities and privileges. We've not asked for them, but in our work, we have been willingly embracing as allies for others, in hopes that we'll move this world a little closer to our vision for equitable and just communities in rural places and across the country. So I know, Terry, you just jumped on to introduce what's coming next, but really your commitment to getting this conference on and your work as an ally for rural communities deserves a moment of celebration. So thank you.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that very warm welcome. I have to say that I am left after that address feeling very deeply humbled and compelled to act in response to Reverend Dr. Barber's challenge of standing against the crisis of morality in pursuit of a moral reset. I don't even know how to rebound after that. But what I will say is that I'm here to transition everyone into the next set of workshops. So we're at the top of the second half of day 2 of the conference. And I don't know about you guys, but I have really enjoyed the workshop content and the presenters, the entertainment. I was absolutely moved by poet Marjai Neal's glaring transparency, her strength, her talent, just wow. If you're like me and you've enjoyed the conference up to this point, stick around while we're headed into our last block of workshops. Be sure to join us back here at 3:45 or in the intermission space that will include remarks by our partners over at the National Endowment of Arts and a quick glimpse of some of the work that's being done under the Citizens Institute of Rural Design, or what we call CIRD. But that's not all. Be sure to join us back in Conference Central from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern for the networking hour. It's a fun space with an opportunity to visit exhibits, the photo booth, photo video booth, and to tour the amazing George Ballas photo exhibits, just to name a few. Also, if you missed any parts of the agenda or workshops on yesterday, you can view them on demand in the conference app. Simply return to the particular agenda page item or that item and select view recording. So head on off to your prospective workshops and meet me in the intermission space at 3:45, after which we'll head over to Conference Central together directly at 4 p.m. Happy workshopping. Thank you.